The USS Bataan arrived in the 5th Fleet Area of Operations in the spring of 2024 with an unusually quiet well deck. No landing craft, no amphibious assault vehicles staged for rapid offload. The Marine Expeditionary Unit that would normally fill her berthing spaces, occupy her vehicle decks, and rehearse beach assault doctrine was not aboard. What was aboard? A reinforced Marine fixed-wing detachment, a complement of F-35Bs, and the full suite of aviation support equipment that turns a Wasp-class hull into something the Navy's official classification system does not have a box for. The Second Fleet did not issue a press release explaining what that meant. The Fifth Fleet did not hold a briefing on the configuration change. The Stars and Stripes reported the deployment. Almost no one in Washington picked up the thread. Tehran read it before most American analysts did. This is the architecture of that signal. Why the Navy walked a near flat top into the most watched strait on Earth without its assault force. What the empty well deck communicated that a carrier strike group alone could not. And why the message registered in one capital, while the debate about what it meant was still being had in another. The hull was the same. The configuration changed everything. One ship, two completely different meanings. The question is which one Iran was supposed to read. A Wasp-class amphibious assault ship displaces approximately 40,000 tons at full load. She is 844 feet long. Her flight deck is not angled, the way a carrier's is, but it is large enough to operate helicopters, MV-22 Ospreys, and vertical takeoff and landing fixed-wing aircraft simultaneously. Her well deck, when flooded down, can launch landing craft and amphibious assault vehicles directly into the water. She is, by design, a platform for projecting Marines onto a hostile shore. But a Wasp-class hull with no MEU aboard and a full complement of F-35Bs is no longer a ship for landing Marines. It is a mobile airfield. The distinction matters more than the tonnage. The F-35B variant carries the same airframe as the F-35A and the carrier-based F-35C, with one critical difference: it is optimized for short takeoff and vertical landing. It does not need a catapult. It does not need an arresting wire. It needs a deck with a ski jump or a flat surface long enough for a short roll, and it needs roughly 300 feet of clearing space for a vertical recovery. A Wasp-class flight deck provides both. That is the engineering fact that makes this configuration possible. What it produces operationally is a small carrier, not a supercarrier, not a nuclear-powered Nimitz or Ford-class vessel with a full carrier air wing of 44 aircraft, but a platform capable of launching and recovering between 6 and 20 F-35Bs, depending on the specific configuration and the operational tempo required. 6 F-35Bs constitute a meaningful fixed-wing strike package in a theater where the alternative, at that moment, was a carrier rotation gap. The rotation gap is the part of the story that explains why the Bataan mattered so much in the spring of 2024. The USS Dwight D. Eisenhower had been operating in the Red Sea and the broader Central Command area of operations since the previous autumn, supporting operations against Houthi missile and drone launches targeting commercial shipping through the Bab el-Mandeb. By early 2024, the Eisenhower had been on station for months. Congressional pressure regarding deployment length was real. The arguments being made about crew fatigue, extended dwell time, and the maintenance costs of sustained high-tempo operations were not abstract. A supercarrier cannot simply be replaced overnight. The logistics of rotating a Nimitz-class or Ford-class vessel into theater involve scheduling, maintenance windows, transit times from Norfolk or Bremerton, and the coordination of an entire strike group, not just the hull. The gap between one carrier leaving and another arriving is a gap in fixed-wing capability. In a theater where Houthi anti-ship ballistic missiles were being launched at commercial vessels and where Iranian naval forces were monitoring every U.S. surface movement through the Strait of Hormuz, a carrier gap was not a theoretical concern. The Navy's answer to that gap was not to rush a supercarrier forward before it was ready. The answer was to retask a platform that was already in theater, already capable of operating fixed-wing aircraft, and capable of reconfiguring its mission profile without a port call and without public announcement of what the reconfiguration meant. Walking the Bataan forward as a fixed-wing basing platform rather than an amphibious assault ship was the Navy solving a carrier gap problem with the assets it had, not the assets it wished it had. That is a different kind of signal than a carrier strike group deployment. It is quieter, it is faster to execute, and it communicates something specific about American institutional flexibility that a standard carrier deployment does not. The question is, what exactly did it communicate, and to whom? If you want to understand why naval platforms move before the headlines explain it, subscribe to Blue Water. The strategy is in the configuration, not the class designation. Start with the geography. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest navigable channel. Approximately 21 million barrels of oil transit that strait every day, representing roughly 20% of global petroleum trade. The nations that depend on that flow include not just the United States and Europe, but China, Japan, South Korea, and India. The strait is not primarily an American strategic interest. It is a global one. That distinction matters for understanding why the signal sent there has audiences far beyond the Persian Gulf. Iran's strategy for the strait has been consistent for decades. It rests on area denial, making the cost of U.S. naval operations inside and adjacent to the strait high enough that American commanders must weigh the risk of transit against the benefit of presence. The tools of that strategy include fast attack craft, mines, anti-ship cruise missiles, coastal defense systems, and most recently, anti-ship ballistic missiles developed with increasing precision and range. The logic is to turn a narrow waterway into a killing ground for large surface combatants and to raise the political cost of any engagement. The U.S. Navy's counter to area denial has been a combination of standoff strike capability, air superiority, and presence signaling. You cannot deny an area to a force that can operate from outside your weapons envelope while striking inside it. The F-35B, operating from a reconfigured amphib rather than a supercarrier, extends that logic one step further. It brings fixed-wing strike capability into the theater without the telegraphing that accompanies a carrier strike group deployment. A carrier strike group deployment is a deliberate signal. The USS Dwight D. Eisenhower moving toward the Red Sea was a headline. A supercarrier's transit is tracked by commercial satellite imagery, reported by shipping news services, and visible to any coastal radar system with the range to pick up a surface contact at 40,000 tons. It is designed to be seen. Its deterrent value depends on being seen. An amphibious assault ship moving into theater does not carry the same automatic flag. An LHA or LHD in the Central Command Area of Operations is a normal operational presence. Amphibious-ready groups transit the region on routine schedules. The hull type does not itself communicate high-end fixed-wing strike capability to a casual observer. What communicates that capability is the aircraft spotted on deck, and the F-35B silhouette at 3 nautical miles of visual range is distinguishable from an MV-22 Osprey. Tehran's intelligence services are not casually observing, so the signal is not covert, but it arrives through a different channel than a carrier deployment, and it carries a different weight in a specific diplomatic and operational context. In the spring of 2024, the specific context was this. The United States was managing multiple simultaneous crises in the Central Command Theater, was under domestic political pressure regarding extended deployments, was publicly committed to not escalating toward direct conflict with Iran, and needed to maintain a deterrent posture without providing Iran with the provocation framing it sought for its own domestic purposes. A second carrier strike group would have been read as escalation. A reconfigured amphib with F-35Bs reads as presence. The difference is not operational, it is diplomatic. What stands out about this configuration decision is what it reveals about American institutional capacity for rapid improvisation within existing procurement constraints. The Navy did not buy a light carrier. It converted a capability it already owned in theater, without a supplemental appropriation, without a program of record, and without a press release. That is not how procurement works on paper. It is exactly how operational necessity works in practice. The well deck, though. Return to the well deck. A Wasp-class ship with its well deck loaded for amphibious operations contains landing craft, specifically L6. Landing craft air cushions, capable of transporting Marines and their equipment from ship to shore across a 40-mile range, at speeds approaching 40 knots. The L6 is the delivery mechanism for an amphibious assault. It is also the thing that an adversary's coastal defense planners must account for when calculating how to defend against a beach landing. The Bataan's well deck in its 2024 configuration was not loaded with L6. It was not staging amphibious assault vehicles. The Marine Infantry Battalion that would have occupied her lower decks was not aboard. This configuration is visible from the air. A reconnaissance pass, a satellite image, or a close-in observation by a small Iranian naval patrol craft would reveal the same thing. The well deck is empty. The ship is configured for aviation, not assault. Most observers reading that observation would conclude, this ship has reduced capability. She is not carrying her full assault force. She is a degraded amphib. That reading is wrong in the most strategically important way. The empty well deck is not a subtraction, it is a substitution. The space and weight freed by removing the amphibious assault component is reallocated to aviation fuel, aviation ordnance, aviation maintenance equipment, and the larger fixed-wing detachment that makes sustained F-35B operations possible. The ship loses the ability to land Marines on a beach. She gains the ability to generate fixed-wing sorties for weeks without a port call. Here is the part that most coverage of this deployment missed. Iran was not going to be the target of an amphibious assault anyway. The MEU was not the deterrent instrument for this specific scenario. The F-35B was, and the ship, reconfigured, became a better instrument for the actual deterrent requirement than she would have been in her standard configuration. The threat an Amphib poses to Iran in standard configuration is, we can land Marines on your coast. That is a real threat, but it is a slow-developing one. An amphibious assault takes days to plan, hours to execute, and requires air superiority over the landing zone before the first LCAC hits the water. The threat the reconfigured Bataan poses is, we have fixed-wing strike aircraft in your backyard right now, and they have been flying sorties since we arrived. That is a faster clock. That is a more immediate operational message. For deterrence at the pace of the 2024 Hormuz situation, where Iranian harassment of commercial shipping was measured in days and hours, not weeks and months, the faster clock was the relevant one. Now consider what happens to the targeting calculus of an Iranian commander watching this situation from the coastal defense side. Iranian anti-ship ballistic missiles, the Kalish Fars and its successors, are designed to engage large surface combatants. The targeting system uses active radar homing in the terminal phase. The targeting geometry is calibrated against vessels in a certain size class, moving at certain speeds, generating certain radar cross-sections. A Wasp-class hull is a target. A Nimitz-class hull is a target. Both present detectable and trackable signatures. What the Iranian targeting system cannot easily solve is the F-35B operating from that hull. The F-35B's low observable airframe is not invisible to all radar systems, but it significantly complicates the engagement timeline for legacy air defense architectures. The aircraft can operate at ranges and altitudes that compress the reaction window for surface-to-air systems. A strike package of 6 to 12 F-35Bs launching from a position 150 nautical miles off the Iranian coast presents a different problem than the same package launching from a carrier at comparable range. The problem it presents is attribution timing. A supercarrier launching a strike package is expected. The command chain for responding to that launch is established. The escalation protocols are rehearsed. An LHA launching a strike package from an area of the Persian Gulf that is normally associated with routine amphib presence creates a processing delay in that command chain. Where did those aircraft come from? Which platform? What is the follow-on package? That delay, measured in minutes, is operationally significant in a scenario where the first minutes of an exchange determine the outcome. The honest question, and the one the Navy's own internal deliberations had to answer before this configuration was approved, is whether a reconfigured Amphib with a reinforced fixed-wing detachment actually deters anything, or whether it is a political solution dressed up as an operational one. Here is the take that will generate some pushback. The reconfigured Amphib worked as deterrence in this specific scenario, not because it added overwhelming capability, but because it added ambiguity. Iran's decision-making in the spring of 2024 was not primarily military. It was political. Tehran was managing its own internal pressures, its relationship with its Houthi proxies, its posture toward the Abraham Accords normalization process it was attempting to disrupt, and its reading of American domestic political willingness to escalate before a presidential election. In that context, a second large-deck U.S. Navy vessel in theater that was difficult to classify, that was operating fixed-wing aircraft without announcing it was doing so, and that was visibly present without presenting itself as an escalation, was more useful as a deterrent than an additional carrier strike group would have been. An additional carrier strike group would have forced Tehran to make a choice, respond visibly to an obvious escalation, or stand down visibly in the face of one. Either choice had domestic costs. The reconfigured Amphib did not force that choice. It simply raised the cost of continued harassment without requiring Tehran to make a public response to an obvious provocation. The ambiguity was the deterrent. The empty well deck was the mechanism. The message registered before the debate about what the message meant had concluded in Washington. Where does this leave the broader strategic competition in the Persian Gulf in the Hormuz corridor? The Fifth Fleet's area of operations covers approximately 2.5 million square miles. Its permanent basing structure runs through Naval Support Activity Bahrain, the most significant U.S. naval installation in the region, roughly 1,200 miles from Tehran. The Fifth Fleet relies on access to ports in Bahrain, the UAE, and Qatar for logistics, maintenance, and crew rotations. Those access relationships are not permanent. They are subject to diplomatic pressure, to the evolving security calculus of Gulf Cooperation Council states managing their own relationships with Iran, and to domestic political pressures within those host nations. The reconfigured Amphib is relevant to that basing vulnerability in a specific way. A supercarrier at sea does not require a port call to remain operationally relevant for 30 to 45 days. Neither does a reconfigured LHA with a fixed-wing detachment and a full aviation fuel load. The at-sea persistence of both hull types buys operational flexibility that is independent of shore-based access. If the political situation in a Gulf state makes a port call diplomatically complicated, the carrier stays at sea. The LHA does the same. The combination of a carrier strike group and a reconfigured amphib in the same theater creates two independent basing nodes for fixed-wing strike aviation, each capable of independent operations, each imposing separate targeting problems on an adversary, and each capable of sustaining operations for weeks without the access relationships that make shore basing possible. That is a different kind of presence than a single carrier strike group provides. Not more powerful in terms of raw sortie generation. A full carrier air wing flying from a Ford-class carrier generates more sorties per day than an LHA with 12 F-35Bs can produce. The reconfigured amphib is not a replacement for a carrier. It is a complement, and specifically one that addresses the scenarios where a carrier alone is either unavailable, politically problematic, or geometrically insufficient to cover the full theater. One detail that stuck from reviewing the coverage of this deployment. Almost every analysis that appeared in Western outlets in the spring of 2024 described the USS Bataan's presence in terms of what she was not carrying. The absent MEU, the reduced marine detachment, the empty well deck. The framing was consistently one of subtraction, of a capability that was missing, of a deployment that was somehow less than a standard amphib. That framing inverted the actual operational logic. The ship was not there despite the absence of the MEU. The ship was there because of the absence of the MEU. The reconfiguration was the capability, not the gap. The Navy understood that. The Fifth Fleet commanders understood that. Tehran, reading the aircraft on the flight deck rather than the berthing manifest, understood that. The analysis community, focused on the platform type and the nominal mission profile, took longer to catch up. The fixed-wing lift math is worth walking through in concrete terms, because the numbers tell the deterrence story more clearly than the doctrinal framing does. A Ford-class carrier air wing at full wartime complement carries approximately 44 fixed-wing aircraft, typically 4 squadrons of FA-18 EFF Super Hornets, an F-35C squadron, an E-2D Hawkeye airborne early warning flight, and an EA-18G Growler electronic warfare element. That package, flying sustained combat operations, generates between 100 and 150 sorties per day depending on mission profile, weather, and aircraft availability rates. A WASP-class LHA operating as a light carrier with a reinforced fixed-wing detachment carries, depending on configuration, between 6 and 20 F-35Bs. At the 12 aircraft mark, flying 2 cycles per day with full availability, that package generates roughly 24 sorties. Against a Ford-class carrier air wing, that number looks small. Against the alternative of 0 fixed-wing capability, during a carrier rotation gap, 24 sorties per day is a deterrent force. The relevant comparison is not Bataan versus a supercarrier. The relevant comparison is Bataan versus the absence of a supercarrier, which is the actual choice that commanders faced in the spring of 2024. 24 F-35B sorties per day into Persian Gulf airspace, generated from a platform that the adversary must simultaneously track, target, and correctly classify, does specific operational work. It maintains the air superiority argument. It sustains the reconnaissance and maritime patrol function that keeps Iranian fast attack craft from operating with impunity in international waters adjacent to the strait. It demonstrates continuous operational presence to the shipping companies, whose vessels transit the Hormuz corridor, and whose commercial decisions are themselves a component of the deterrence calculation. Because a shipping company that routes its tankers away from the Hormuz corridor because it does not believe the U.S. Navy can protect them, has already awarded Iran a strategic victory without a single missile being fired. The F-35B's specific capabilities in this context include its sensor fusion architecture, which allows a single pilot to manage a much larger battle space picture than legacy fighters could prosecute, and its compatibility with the Marine Air-Ground Task Force command structure, which differs from the carrier-based naval aviation command chain in ways that give theater commanders additional flexibility in how the aircraft are tasked and how their intelligence products are integrated. On that point, most people assume the F-35B operating from an LHA is simply a smaller version of the F-35C operating from a carrier, but the evidence tells a different story about command and tasking integration. The Marine Aviation Detachment that embeds with an LHA for this kind of fixed-wing basing mission brings its own ground-based command element, its own intelligence processing capacity, and its own targeting authority structure that runs through Marine Corps aviation channels rather than through the carrier air wing command chain. That parallel authority structure is in itself a capability, because it means the theater commander has 2 independent decision chains for fixed-wing employment, which reduces single point of failure risk in the command architecture. The basing tail for the Fifth Fleet's F-35B operations in this theater runs not just through the ships themselves but through the support infrastructure that enables sustained operations. Al Dhafra Air Base in the UAE, approximately 150 nautical miles from the Strait of Hormuz, provides a shore-based maintenance and logistics node for UASAF and allied aviation in the theater. Naval Support Activity Bahrain handles fleet logistics and crew support for surface ships. The combination of ship-based and shore-based infrastructure creates a support architecture that can sustain operations even if one node becomes unavailable. The vulnerability in that architecture is the one the Persian Gulf-specific geography imposes. Everything flows through the strait, or around it. A closure of the Strait of Hormuz, even a temporary or partial one, disrupts not just commercial shipping but the logistic support chains that sustain the U.S. military presence in the theater. The Fifth Fleet's basing in Bahrain sits inside the Gulf. The supply ships that service the fleet transit the strait. The fuel that keeps aviation operations running comes through terminals accessible only through the Hormuz choke point or by overland routes that are themselves vulnerable to interdiction. The Navy's response to that vulnerability is partially the at-sea endurance argument already discussed. Ships that can operate for 30 to 45 days without a port call are less exposed to a temporary strait closure than shore-based forces. But the deeper response is the sustained deterrent argument. The reason Iran has not closed the strait, despite repeated declarations of intent and decades of capability development aimed at doing so, is that the cost calculation does not work. A strait closure triggers not just an American military response but an international coalition response because the 20% of global oil trade that transits Hormuz is not American oil. It is everyone's oil, including China's and India's, and both Beijing and New Delhi have their own reasons to ensure the strait remains open. Iran understands that calculation. The deterrent works, imperfectly and incompletely, but it works. The reconfigured Bataan was one additional data point in that calculation. One more piece of evidence that the cost of testing the deterrent was higher than the benefit of testing it. What do you think in the comments? Whether deploying amphibious ships in this configuration as de facto light carriers is a sustainable long-term strategy or a stopgap that papers over the real force structure gap in American carrier aviation? Drop your answer below, and the responses from serving and former naval officers in these threads are something we read carefully. The open questions in the Hormuz theater as of mid-2026 are not about whether the reconfigured Amphib concept works. It demonstrably does. The open questions are structural. First, Congress has not formally acknowledged the light carrier role of the America-class and Wasp-class ships, and the procurement implications of that role are not reflected in the current shipbuilding budget. If the Navy intends to routinely deploy LHAs in fixed-wing basing configurations, the support infrastructure, the sustainment funding, the training pipelines for expanded F-35B air crews, and the maintenance capacity for extended aviation operations from these hulls need to be built into the base budget. They are not. The current arrangement depends on robbing marine aviation readiness to support theater deterrence requirements, and that trade has a cost that does not appear in the operational success columns. Second, the F-35B's vertical landing mode imposes a thermal and structural cost on LHA flight decks that was not fully accounted for in the original ship design specifications. High operational tempo in the fixed-wing basing configuration accelerates flight deck degradation at a rate that standard amphib operations do not produce. The Navy is managing that maintenance challenge without a formal program of record for addressing it, which means it is being managed through supplemental funding requests and maintenance schedule adjustments that are not transparent in the standard budget process. Third, the Iran deterrence argument rests on a specific Iranian threat model that may not remain static. Tehran's investment in longer-range anti-ship ballistic missiles, in drone swarm capabilities that complicate close-in defense, and in hardened coastal defense infrastructure along the strait's northern shore continues. The deterrent geometry that worked in spring 2024 may require different force configurations in 2026 and beyond. Whether the Navy has the assets and the flexibility to maintain the deterrent as the threat evolves is a question whose answer is not yet visible. The comfortable reading of the Bataan deployment is that American institutional improvisation and operational flexibility compensated for a force structure gap in a way that preserved deterrence at an acceptable cost. That reading is probably correct for the spring of 2024 timeline. The less comfortable reading is that the deployment was a creative solution to a structural problem, and creative solutions to structural problems do not scale indefinitely. The carrier rotation gap that made the Bataan's reconfigured mission necessary was itself a symptom of a shipbuilding program that has consistently under-delivered on schedule, a maintenance enterprise that has accumulated a backlog measured in ship years, and a deployment demand signal that exceeds the Navy's capacity to meet it on standard timelines. Will deploying amphibious ships as light carriers become a permanent feature of American naval force structure, or a temporary patch until the shipbuilding program catches up? Comment yes if you think this becomes the new normal, and NO if you think the carrier fleet gets rebuilt to the point where this workaround becomes unnecessary. The comments on this question from people tracking the shipbuilding legislation have been sharp. The broader strategic point that the Bataan deployment illustrates applies beyond the Persian Gulf and beyond the Iran deterrence problem. The United States Navy does not have enough hulls to be everywhere it needs to be at the time it needs to be there with the force package that standard doctrine prescribes. It has never had that luxury, and it will not have it in the foreseeable future. What it does have is the operational flexibility, the institutional knowledge, and the platform diversity to assemble force packages from non-standard combinations of assets that address specific deterrence requirements in specific theaters at specific moments. That flexibility is a capability. It is not as visible as a carrier strike group. It does not generate the same headline. But it is arguably more relevant to the actual deterrence challenges of the current period than the standard metric of carrier strike group deployments, because the current period's challenges are characterized precisely by the requirement to project presence and capability at multiple points simultaneously without the force structure to do it by the book. The Bataan sailed into the Fifth Fleet area of operations as an amphibious assault ship without her assault force. She operated as a mobile fixed-wing basing platform. She generated sorties. She maintained presence. She contributed to a deterrent calculation that held. She sailed home. The geography she argued for did not move. The strait remained open. The math that made her relevant in that moment has not changed. And the next time a carrier rotation creates a gap in theater fixed-wing coverage, the Navy will face the same choice. Wait for the right hull, or reconfigure the hull it has. The board favors the configured option. The question that remains unresolved is whether the Navy will invest in building the doctrine, the maintenance infrastructure, and the procurement lines that turn an improvised solution into a durable capability. That investment has not been made. The operational requirement that would justify it has not gone away. The empty well deck was the loudest part of the signal. It still is.